we've been having at the conference the past 3 days. Please join us in welcoming Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor of the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, as well as the co-founder of the Center for Law and Policy Research, and whose leadership in legal education is bringing critical perspectives to the field of legal policy. Professor Krishnaswamy, whenever you're ready, we can start the presentation. Yes, Dr. Krishnaswamy, we can start. Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, sorry, your voice faded in and out. Thank you for the introduction, and good evening, and thank you for the invitation to deliver a keynote address at the 8th India Land Development Conference at Flame University. Pranab Chaudhary and Narayana invited me to deliver this address, and I'm deeply honored by the invitation. And first and foremost, let me apologize for not being able to make it there in person. It's the first week of term, a new term at the law school here in Bangalore, and for better or for worse, things tend to get a little more hectic and busy than we'd like it. And so I'm stuck here, but I'm glad that I can participate online, especially because I've had the opportunity to participate and learn from the Indian Land Development Conferences in the past. And I trust that I will be able to engage more actively and in person in the years ahead. The theme of the 8th edition of the India Land Development Conference is land tenure transitions, climatization, or communitization. The conference aims to study the emerging and changing relationships between land and people in the context of climate change and adaptation strategies that have emerged in the recent decades. I have not researched and published on this issue at any length, and so I will use this keynote to pull together some early reflections on these issues as I've encountered them. So I haven't worked exactly on the question of what climate change effects there might be on land tenure systems. So I take it that the technical sessions that I've missed have dealt with this issue, and I look to catch up on that with the proceedings of the conference. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to briefly go over recent Supreme Court positioning on the question of climate change and what that can tell us about the nature of land issues, should they arise. Second, I'm going to spend a brief amount of time on the possibility of a decolonizing move on land laws. And I'm going to refer to some recent work in the field that should give us some pause should we go in that direction. And then I'll conclude with reasons why I think we're in an exciting moment, because land law and land tenurial issues, which are in a sense perpetual backwaters in intellectual and political terms, somehow seem to have moved center stage. And I'll conclude with that. So I think most members, colleagues present at this conference would be familiar with the position that the Indian Supreme Court took in a recent case called Ranjit Singh versus Union of India. This is a 2024 Supreme Court case where the court had to consider whether overhead transmission electricity cables for a solar power project that affected the habitat of a critically endangered species, namely the great Indian bustard and the lesser florican, should be forced to go underground. This was the narrow question: overground cables versus underground transmission cables. There are other reliefs that are being pleaded in the case, some directions relating to the breeding of the species and so on and so forth. I won't go into all of that. I just want to focus on this question of climate change and how the court approached the question of climate change and development. I suspect that this case gives us clues about how the court might adjudicate on climate change issues in the way it relates to other natural resources, including land. So the court has 2 parts to this case. There are 2 aspects of this case that are worth emphasizing. First, the court's conclusions in this case, which are relatively modest. And second, the court's analysis of how climate change might fit into Supreme Court adjudication on the Constitution, that which has much larger and longer range ramifications in the years to come. So let me begin with the more modest point, which is that the court finally concluded that while balancing two equally crucial goals, in this case, the conservation of the great Indian bustard with the conservation of the environment as a whole, because please understand that on the other side of this question was a solar power project transmission lines. So there was a green argument on both sides. The court's view was that it could not sacrifice either of these two goals. It said a delicate balance must be maintained. You can't compromise one for the other, so no single issue trumps the other. And then it suggested that if you constrain solar power projects, that its climate change impacts might be so dramatic that other endangered species may suffer, that rising temperatures might lead to other disastrous environmental consequences. And hence, it couldn't be that the conservation goal of the great Indian bustard in this case could trump the question of transmission lines. So it also took the view that this rather technical question of whether transmission lines at 220 kV should be underground or overground is not a question where the court must interfere without expert guidance. So it took the view that an expert committee should be appointed, while the preservation of the great Indian bustard is not negotiable, that it should be reconciled in a sustainable development context with the other international commitments that the country has made on renewable energy and so on, and that this is a matter that should be left to the experts to devise a reasonable solution. So in some sense, in a case like this, the court adopts a model of cost-benefit analysis that is not very different from what the court does in other environmental cases. What is significant here is that on one side of the scale is the argument relating to climate change, but as I will point out as I conclude, there might be some peculiar circumstances to this case that make it less amenable to an outright decision. Let me now move to the right that the court recognized, because this is the part of the decision that might well have a long impact in the years to come. So the Indian Supreme Court has at a much earlier stage recognized the idea that a clean environment, that we have a fundamental right to a clean environment. This happened in the late 80s and early 90s, and the court has consistently upheld that position. Now, what does this have to do with climate change? Now, the court recognizes in this case that climate change is a threat to a clean environment. And it seems to suggest that the right to clean environment must entail a commitment to stop climate change. So it now repositions that this right, or rather re-articulates this right as a distinct right, that we almost have a right against the impacts of climate change, which it locates in Articles 14 and 21, the equality and the right to life articles of the Constitution. And it seems to suggest that the state has an obligation to protect its citizens against the vagaries of climate change. So the significant move in this case is to take climate change and re-articulate it as a separate concern under Article 21 and Article 14. Why Article 14? Because the court makes it clear that while we are all concerned with the ill effects of climate change, that we must particularly focus on underserved communities which have acute food and water shortages arising out of environmental degradation. So the emphasis that there is an equity dimension to the climate change question, or the climate change right, is one that is significant, and it's in para 25 of the opinion. So we don't see it primarily as a liberty right that the state is obliged to protect against climate change, but there's an equity dimension that is baked in to the climate change right in the Ranjit Singh case. Now, this case is quite rightly celebrated as the first substantive decision recognizing a right against climate change. But we noticed in the earlier part of what I shared that the remedy in this case was far from categorical. So if you have a right against climate change, does it mean that climate change wins at the bar at every occasion? Clearly not, because even in a case like this, the court called for a balancing approach. Now, this maybe we can understand this relief to be particular to the peculiar facts of the case, because climate change was argued on both sides. What matters and what must be keenly looked out for is whether the Supreme Court will categorically enforce climate change interests against other development interests more generally. In other words, if the Great Indian Bustard or the conservation, preservation of the Great Indian Bustard was ranged against a coal project, would the court understand the Article 14 and 21 right against climate change to automatically mean that a coal project cannot proceed in this manner? This is a moot question, a question that no doubt will arise in the court sooner than later. Some of the land tenurial issues that arise out of large solar power projects, which take up large amounts of land, might raise similar questions, and we must closely watch how high courts and the Supreme Court might deal with an issue like this. Let me move now to my second point about decolonization. Currently, we are caught up in a national mood of decolonizing our laws and the legal system. We have already witnessed the enactment of new criminal laws. Is land law next? And if so, how should we think through this possibility? Rather than engage particularly with each of the land laws and their forms of codification, I would recommend to all colleagues at the conference a recent book by Rob Travers titled The Empires of Complaints, Mughal Law and the Making of British India, 1765 to 1793. This was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2022. Why this book? The book explores two important themes. First, the British colonization and transformation of Mughal Persianate forms of governance in 18th century India. Secondly, the Indian practices of petitioning and claims making in relation to disputes about land, debt, and taxation using English and Persian language sources. So, two main concerns: forms of governance and forms of petitioning. Notably, it points out how the early company courts adopted to the high volumes of arzis or petitions filed by Indian petitioners litigating land disputes. So what the book describes, and quite evocatively, is that the volume of these petitions and disputes entering initially the British administrative system and then quietly being pushed out into a revenue court system is staggering. So for those of us who are concerned about the large flood of land litigation in contemporary Indian courts, we gain a quiet comfort knowing that this is a problem that we first encountered more than 200 years ago. The second aspect of the argument in the book shows the essential continuity and adaptation of legal forms of Mughal land law into early company law. The adoption of tenurial systems and methods of petitioning and settling land claims from the Mughal period gave the practice of land law in India a distinct flavor from that in England. The argument here is not to show that the British rulers were benign in their motivations, but instead to clarify how an imperial and colonial system of civil law was built through selective adaptations and reworkings of Mughal norms and precedents. As contemporary law and policy practitioners in the field, we learn valuable lessons. Let me at least highlight two. First, the claim that the colonial origins of land laws, that land laws have colonial origins, is one that we should be cautious to make. The British system, for sure, was vicarious on the pre-existing Mughal systems. And for those of us who have spent time looking at early land law, understand that the Mughal systems were parasitic, built on pre-existing land revenue systems, both Persian and Indian, that predated the Mughal system. So essentially, we see a remarkable continuity around land law and land norms in the Indian subcontinent over 200 years for sure, but arguably for 400 to 500 years. Secondly, and more humorously, that the problem of land litigation has exceptionally deep cultural resonances in the subcontinent. The British surprise at the sophistication and the care with which land-related petitioning occurs in the early company law period is one that is striking in its detail in this book. And for those of us who travel into the land revenue courts and into the appellate court system, looking at land law litigation can recognize these deep cultural resonances which seem to stay with us after such a long period of time. So having and embracing this idea of continuity of land law governance issues over a period of time, I think responds to this question of colonial origin in a slightly different way that we might do if we were hasty about our conclusions. Let me now conclude. Many of us working in the field of land law and regulation are used to working in a slow-moving field where decades of research and intervention yield modest results at best. However, this appears now to be beginning to change. When YS Jagannath Reddy government brought in the Andhra Pradesh Land Titling Act of 2023, one might have been inclined to view it as a daring effort at land reform and land governance reform. Quickly, though, this statute became a highly contested part of the 2024 Lok Sabha and Legislative Assembly elections, and unfortunately, not one that had a favorable impact on the election prospects of the incumbent government. Suddenly, land titling and land revenue has come center stage. So I think that in the context of the 8th India Land Development Conference, it's fair to say that we live in more interesting times. Land law and land revenue systems now seem to occupy the center stage of political attention. Those of us following these issues in the various states understand that these issues have now emerged as potential areas for reform and legislation, significant changes after years of attention and research on these questions. So interesting for that reason. It's also interesting that the theme of this conference suggests that tectonic shifts in politics, economy, and ecology that climate change promises seems to change the very foundations of how we might think about land ownership, land tenure, and land governance. So we have these two, foundational shifts occurring in our field at the same time. And I think that makes both the timing of this conference and all of your work exciting and important. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I hand back to the MC and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.